Hi everybody, welcome to the video. Today we're going to be talking about the Old Testament. We'll talk about what it is and what it's about, and then at the end we'll talk about why it's important to us today. Some interesting facts about the Old Testament. It's made up of 39 books written by various authors. Some authors wrote more than one book, while some authors only wrote one book. It was written from the time period of 1350 BC to about 400 BC. And it contains the story of God's people, the Israelite nation, and the covenant promise that he made to them. Now, when you're studying the Old Testament, it can help to divide it up into sections. This can make it a little easier to understand. We'll talk about those sections now. The first section I want to talk about is called the Torah, and this is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It has many of the famous stories that you've heard of, like Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark, the story of Abraham, which was one of the patriarchs. God made a promise to Abraham that he would have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky, and we see that promise is true today. This also contains the story of the Israelites going into exile in Egypt, and then God sends Moses to lead them out of Egypt. Of course, this is the famous story about parting the Red Sea and wandering for 40 years in the desert. Now, while they were in the desert, God made a covenant with the people of Israel as well. He gave them the 10 Commandments and the book of the law, which contains all the Jewish laws. And then he asked them to honor him and obey him. And that was the covenant. Of course, they didn't do this very well, and that's why they wandered for 40 years in the desert. Now, at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses passes away, and the Israelite nation is getting ready to enter the promised land that God had given to them. And this brings us to the book of Judges. These are the historical books. All right, Joshua takes over for Moses, leads the Israelite nation into the promised land where they're ruled by different judges for the next few hundred years. They eventually decide that they want a king, and God appoints King Saul to rule over them. This becomes the kingdom of Israel now. Of course, that leads to King David, one of the most famous kings in the Bible, and his son, King Solomon. King David was known as a man that was after God's own heart. King Solomon is known as the wisest man to ever live. After King Solomon dies, the kingdom of Israel splits into the north and the south. The north is Israel, and the south is Judah. Israel is eventually conquered by the Assyrians. Judah is eventually conquered by the Babylonians. Eventually, a small remnant of Israelites is able to return to Jerusalem. They build the second temple, and then they believe that the Spirit of God left Jerusalem. There's no more writing after about 400 BC. Another section of the Old Testament that we can divide up is the poetry and wisdom section. This contains Psalms and Proverbs. These are books of Hebrew poetry. And sometimes they can be difficult to understand, but in order to read them and kind of understand what they're saying, you can use a technique of parallelism. And parallelism is simply using 2 lines together to build on one idea. The 2 lines are related to each other, often building on each other or opposite of each other. And the last section I want to talk about is the section of prophets. Now, these can be divided up into major and minor prophets. The 4 major prophets were Isaiah, Jeremiah, who also wrote Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then there's a section of 12 minor prophets. Now, these prophets weren't minor because they were less important. It's because the books that they wrote were smaller. There are several famous prophecies in these books. Isaiah 53 is known for prophesying the death of Jesus on the cross. Daniel gave many prophecies that scholars believe haven't come true today. Of course, there were other prophecies as well in these books, some about Babylon destroying Judah and other conquests of the time. Now, you may be asking yourself, why were these books included and not other books that were written at the same time period? Well, there were 3 major criteria that the Israelites used to determine which books would be included in the Old Testament canon or official collection. First, the book had to be written by a prophet or a spirit-led person. Second, the book had to be determined to be written to all generations, not just the generation that was living at the time. And third, it had to be written in accord with previous revelations from the books that were already accepted. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why does this matter to me? Why is this important? It happened thousands of years ago. Well, what makes the Old Testament so unique is that this is God's revelation to us. He's revealing to us who he is. He's telling us about himself. He's telling us what he likes, what he finds acceptable, and he's also telling us what he dislikes and what is unacceptable to him. And that's what makes the Old Testament so amazing, is that God is letting us know who he is. Imagine if we lived in a world where we didn't know these things. We didn't have any idea. We were just here with no history or no revelation of the past. It would be chaos. That's all the time I have for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.